welcome to the 43rd Annual Foulkes Lecture. I'm very much looking forward to Juan's lecture and to Earl's response. I'd like to welcome those of you who are returning, and more particularly those who are here for the first time. I also want to mention those who are not able to be here in person, but who are following the live stream at the moment. Of course, we'd like you all to be here, but we understand that there are all sorts of obstacles to people actually finding their way or being able to be here. So it's very good that you can be with us on the live stream. And don't forget, if you are watching, that you can make comments whilst watching. This annual meeting has significance for us because it symbolizes survival, growth, development, and creativity for us as a society and as individuals with an interest in group analysis. We are meeting in the midst of continuing crises in the social and political order. London is the capital of the second most unequal country in the world, a city where 1 person in every 53 is homeless, and 37% of children live in relative poverty. The institutions of liberal democracy appear broken, and commitment to building an enlightened welfare state has yet to be renewed. Globally, freedom of movement is increasingly policed and curtailed. War and starvation are the real and present conditions of life for millions of our fellows. Ocean levels are rising and millions of species facing extinction. From first principles, we recognize that all of our projects are permeated by these embracing circumstances, that a healthy organization is not one that imagines it can inoculate itself against their influence, but which recognizes that they inevitably find expression in our relationships with one another and with the world. We won't all agree in our responses to the conflicts arising from these developments, thankfully. But what specially characterizes a group analytic spirit is our determination to create and to protect spaces of equality where, in the face of our differences, we strive to maintain communication, thinking, and we always hope, understanding. Before Lindy introduces Juan, I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking somebody who many of you know as the heart of the society, the person who works in our office every week and holds so much for us, which is, of course, Julia.
Thank you. Just couple of things. I feel like I'm having my graduation again, because I actually graduated here years ago. So thank you so much for this lovely gesture. I didn't expect it, and I feel very emotional. And thank you to the Manual Committee. Thank you to Lindy, Sarah. Every week we actually, not only myself at the office, but also with both of them, actually we have to, do the things at the office in order to carry on with our work and make the society, running, because it's something that just is changing constantly since I start. And so it's been a lot of members now since I start. So the whole thing is just an experience, and we just just thank you so much for that, and for the lovely gesture and recognizing the work at the office. Thank you. Of course, I'm not. Of course, I got an assistant now. Even she's once a week, but it's a help, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So, good evening and welcome everyone. It's a very great pleasure to introduce Juan Tubert-Oklander, who is going to be our speaker tonight. He is a psychoanalyst, a group analyst, and a marriage and family psychotherapist. He was born and studied medicine and trained as a group therapist in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He lives and has worked in private practice in Mexico City since 1976, where he trained in adult and child psychoanalysis, and he's now a Mexican citizen. Author of numerous papers and book chapters published in Spanish, English, Italian, French, Portuguese, Czech, and Hebrew. Co-author with Reina Hernandez Tubet of Operative Groups, the Latin American approach to group analysis, and author of Theory of Psychoanalytic Practice, a relational process approach. The One and the Many, Relational Psychoanalysis and Group Analysis, which many of you will be familiar, as well as several books in Spanish. He's a full member of the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association and the International Psychoanalytic Association, honorary member of the Group Analytic Society International, founding member of the International Field Theory Association, and member of the International Association of Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. Professor in the master's degree course of psychoanalytic psychotherapy at the Marista University of Merida. So, welcome, Juan. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to your talk. Juan will be speaking from here.
Thank you. I am glad to be here with you tonight. I hope you are still glad when I finish. Well, my paper is called Beyond Psychoanalysis and Group Analysis, the urgent need for a new paradigm of the human being. First, I wish to thank the managing committee of the Group Analytic Society International for bestowing upon me the honor and giving me the opportunity to address you by delivering this 43rd annual S.H. Foulkes Lecture, this being our society's major annual academic event. It is also an occasion to reflect on what we have been doing with the legacy of our founder and the direction in which group analysis is moving nowadays. Let us start from the beginning. Group analysis is most certainly a fruitful development of that momentous inquiry of human nature and experience inaugurated by Sigmund Freud. But we all know that it is not a mere application of the theories and technique of psychoanalysis, but an analytic inquiry in itself. Foulkes created group analysis as an exploration of human life in groups, carried out by the members of a group under the guidance of a conductor who maintained an analytic attitude vis-à-vis the group and put on hold his theories and assumptions in order to observe and understand whatever was happening in the session. Thus, group analysis was able to formulate its own concepts and theories derived from the group analytic experience in the same way as psychoanalysis did with the bipersonal psychoanalytic experience. Hence, I have maintained for quite a few years now that psychoanalysis and group analysis are but two aspects of the wider field of analysis. This precludes any hierarchical evaluation of both disciplines. Besides, group analysis can be seen as a quite successful attempt to transcend some deficiencies of traditional psychoanalytic theory and practice, derived from the exclusion of the environmental factors, such as actual relationships with real people and the impact of the social, cultural, and political contexts. This accounts for the affinity of group analysis with the independent group's object relations theory, self-psychology, and the relational and intersubjective approaches to psychoanalysis. 14 years ago, I had a conversation with Malcolm Pines during the long interview Reina Hernandez Tubert and I did with him, which was later published in Group Analysis, in which we discussed, among many other things, the relationship between psychoanalysis and group analysis. I then said I had a feeling that group analysis is what psychoanalysis should have been, but never was. Malcolm assented and said, I am quoting Malcolm. He said, I always said that psychoanalysis is slowly moving to where it should be, which is group analysis. And through relational psychology and self-psychology, it is moving in that direction. End of quote. So, why the title of this lecture, Beyond Psychoanalysis and Group Analysis? If psychoanalysis and group analysis are but two aspects of a single field, and the latter represents an improvement and further development of the former, is there any need to go beyond them? I shall explain why I believe there is. Freud made a revolutionary discovery that the greatest part of our experiences, feelings, thoughts, motivations, beliefs, capacities, and intentions are unknown to us and beyond our conscious control. This he called the unconscious. He also found that many of them are not only unknown by, but shocking and unacceptable to our conscious mentation, so that we make a purposive but also unconscious effort to ignore and forget them. This he called repression. These discoveries, which do not only apply to individual human beings, but to interpersonal relations, groups, institutions, communities, nations, international relations, and humankind as a whole, should have brought about a major revolution in epistemology and in our conception of the human being. But such evolution was stalled by Freud's adherence to several assumptions that were an essential part of his Weltanschauung, or conception of the world. These were: 1, materialistic metaphysics; 2, the Cartesian subject; 3, deterministic positivism; 4, neutral objectivism; and 5, rejection of teleology. In sum, this implied the individualistic paradigm and the misguided attempt to turn the discipline he had created into a positivistic science framed in the model of the natural sciences. The individualistic paradigm takes the individual organism as the starting point and material basis of all mental activity. This implies identifying the mind with the brain and the unwarranted assumption that all mental processes must happen within in between quotes, the individual, thus summarily rejecting any claim to the existence of collective mental processes. If mind is merely an epiphenomenon of brain function, how can there be something like group mental processes? A group has no brain, any more than it has a group liver. Hence, there is no such thing as a group mind. Consequently, all the mental phenomena to be studied by psychoanalysis are perforce internal, what is usually known as intrapsychic. Nonetheless, this prejudice did not prevent Freud from initiating in some of his social writings, such as Totem and Taboo and Moses and Monotheism, the study of collective mental processes. What he did not do, is extract the inevitable consequences of these studies and include them in his formal theory. This is one of the contradictions between his practice and discoveries on the one hand, and the formal theory he was trying to develop under the name of metapsychology on the other. Foulkes strove from the beginning of his work with and thinking about groups to transcend these limitations of Freud's thought. Thus he wrote in his first book, An Introduction to Group Analytic Psychotherapy, the following lines. I'm quoting. Each individual, itself an artificial, though plausible abstraction, is basically and centrally determined, inevitably, by the world in which he lives, by the community, the group of which he forms a part. End of quote. This very same stance was taken by Enrique Pichon Rivière, the founder of what I deem to be an alternative and independent Latin American school of group analysis, in these terms, quote, one cannot think in terms of a distinction between the individual and society. It is an abstraction, a reductionism that we cannot accept because we carry society within us. End of quote. Both authors affirmed in all their writings the primary and essential social nature of the human being, and Foulkes went even further in questioning the assumption, derived from materialistic metaphysics and common sense thinking, that only matter and energy are real, and that any other alleged entity is either non-existent or an epiphenomenon of material processes. From this point of view, mind is nothing but an aspect of brain function, and social processes are only a consequence of individual psychology. That was the point of view Freud developed in group psychology and the analysis of the ego. But Foulkes wrote in 1967 that, quote, to me, it does not seem difficult to accept that communication, verbal or otherwise, can take place from one mind to the other with complete disregard of whether the brain substance is located in one or other skull of the participants. End of quote. He was thus clearly stating that non-material entities such as communication, relations, and group and social processes were indeed real. Gregory Bateson would most certainly include them in his extended concept of mind. But this revolutionary stand of Foulkes coexisted, as Farhad Dalal has shown, with an unquestioned allegiance to Freud's theory and practice. Thus, although he conceived the group analytic process as derived from a free-floating conversation among the group members, in which the conductor's contribution, beyond establishing the group and providing the conditions for the process to develop, consisted in being present and not in implementing technical interventions such as interpretations, in his actual clinical work, most of his interventions were interpretations, usually framed in terms of Freudian theory. This has been analyzed by Dalal as a contradiction between a radical Foulkes and an orthodox Foulkes, which generates an inner tension in his work. It seems that revolutionary thinkers, such as Freud and Foulkes, cannot fully assume or even recognize the consequences of their rupture from the tradition in which they have been reared, and so need to keep a part of the latter side by side with the new ideas they are generating. This, of course, requires a split in their personality, what Freud called Spaltung. that allows the coexistence of two different and mutually incompatible trends of thought without experiencing or acknowledging the underlying contradictions, since they never come into contact with each other. The very same thing may be said about the present-day reality of group analysis. Most group analysts who have had an extensive study of Foulkes' writings seems to be only lip service to the principles of group analysis, but work in the clinic under one or other version of orthodox bipersonal psychoanalysis. Hence, they assign an undue importance to the analyst's interpretations, framed in terms of the Oedipus complex or the mother-child relationship, and focus on the intrapsychic rather than the interpersonal or social dimensions. Consequently, as pointed out once again by Dalal, quote, group events are understood through the transference by reference to past history, and the history that is used is the history of asocial individuals. This throws into relief the absence of a group analytic paradigm, one that might take account of the history of social groups, end of quote. This establishes a social fact, the subservience of the community of group analysts vis-à-vis their highly prestigious relative, which manifests itself both in the use of various orthodox psychoanalytic theories in the understanding and interpretation of the patient's behavior and discourse, and in attitudes that mimic a stereotyped image of what an analyst should be, such as neutrality, abstinence, and anonymity. But the problem is even deeper, since a Weltanschauung, understood as a set of assumptions about reality and existence that underlies all our experiences, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and actions, is derived from the earliest introjections of our primary personal relations and of the social context in which they occur. It is therefore mainly unconscious, unacknowledged, and unthinkable, since we tend to take it as just the way things are. Hence, it is most difficult or almost impossible to modify. And the individual paradigm, that is, the belief that only individuals are real and that our conscious experience of self and agency is what we actually are, is so ingrained in our experience and thought that any attempt to undermine it is felt as a threat to the stability of our experiential world and our sanity, what Bateson called an epistemological crisis, and Bion named catastrophic change. Of course, such a rupture of the continuity of our mental processes can either be a calamity or a major opportunity for growth, but it is never an easy matter. Hence, we are in dire need to revise those aspects of our Weltanschauung, conception of the world, and Lebensanschauung, conception of life, that precede and underlie all our theories and practice, and obstruct the development of the path opened by the emergence of both psychoanalysis and group analysis. These constitute what we may call the individual paradigm, which needs to be transcended. Hence, we have to go beyond psychoanalysis and group analysis. But is this really necessary? I believe it is. If all that was required were to substitute a social paradigm for an individual one, it would be enough to take the group seriously, to borrow Dalal's happy expression, and the new group analytic paradigm would replace the outdated one of orthodox psychoanalysis. Several of our most gifted colleagues are working along this line, Among them, to mention only those I know best and had an influence on my own thought, are Farhad Dalal, Earl Hopper, and Malcolm Pines. But we need much more than that. Our present world is facing a major crisis which threatens our very survival. Our contemporary society unreservedly endorses a view of human existence as a perpetual competition, a ruthless cannibalistic struggle for survival, prestige, power, pleasure, and wealth, in which there is only a place for winners. This is fully consistent with the individual paradigm and with Freud's conviction, in consonance with his bourgeois conception of life, that the human being is primarily and essentially selfish, and that, quote, the motive force of all human activities is a striving towards the two confluent goals of utility and a yield of pleasure, end quote. Such conception leaves out the traditional values of solidarity, compassion, and care for other human beings, and fosters a general attitude of selfishness and lack of concern for other people who are apart from one's inner circle of relationships, one's family, and, to a much lesser extent, friends, thus bringing about a fracture in the very fabric of society. Of course, neither psychoanalysis nor group analysis can, by themselves, reverse or solve such a widespread social tendency, but their joint voices can contribute, if they stick to a social paradigm that endorses and promotes Pat de Marais' values of koinonia, to a collective effort stemming from multiple and very different sources, to question our present conception of life and restore humanness to social life. But that's not all there is to it. We need to transcend the fetters of materialistic metaphysics in order to fully acknowledge the existence of non-material entities, such as thoughts, feelings, values, relations, meanings, and social processes. This in the field of ontology. In that of epistemology, we need to go beyond the empiricism, positivism, and rationalism of modern science and common thought, which view human knowledge exclusively as a product of the split-off intellect, rather than an outcome of our whole being's relation and belonging to the world. You do not need an evidence-based research or a complex logical proof in order to know whether your spouse loves you or not. And if you do know, this knowledge is an evidence in itself. Much in the same vein, a patient and an analyst, or a whole group, including the conductor, may reach a shared conviction about some conclusion they have arrived through their mutual relation and dialogue, of which they are quite sure, even if they may not be able to convince other people who have not been there. Indeed, the validity of the findings of our analytic inquiry is to be based on our experience of the process of reaching them. In the field of axiology and ethics, the fact that we have assigned an ontological status to values implies that neither science nor analysis can ever be neutral. The quest for knowledge is always intentional. Hence, it is necessarily motivated by personal or social interests and values. It is an attempt to solve a problem and therefore depends on the reasons the inquirer had for conceiving that it is a problem. This has been extensively studied by the sociology of knowledge, from Emil Durkheim through Karl Mannheim and Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckman to Michel Foucault. In the field of psychoanalysis, Willy Baranger published in 1992 an article called On the Necessary Indeterminacy of the Psychoanalytic Classification of Mental Diseases. in which he puts forward the idea that all diagnoses are relative, since they are constructed by the analyst on the basis of a series of assumptions about the patient's suffering held by the analyst, the patient, his or her relatives, and society. Quote from Barangay: "The private individual neurosis in its concept comes from an artificial dissection made by the psychopathologist. Consequently, any serious attempt at analysis should include a shared reflection on our respective values, including the analysts and their ethical implications. There is still another major aspect that should be a part of the development of a new paradigm, and this is the need to transcend the major split between mind and body that characterizes Western thought since Descartes. Of course, this is an ancient problem which has had several answers in the history of human thought. Such answers are either dualistic or monistic. Dualism maintains that the human being is made of two substances, mind and body. Its main problem is explaining how they influence each other. Monism claims that there is only one substance in the human being, and it may take one of three forms. Materialistic monism, also called physicalism, affirms that only matter is real, and that the so-called mind is just a particular form of its organization. This is the view of contemporary natural science. Idealism states that mind or spirit is the only reality, and that the material world is only an appearance. This was Plato's and Berkeley's conception, and also that of most religions. Finally, neutral monism is the idea that the reality of human existence is neither material nor mental, but appears as one or the other in different contexts and depending on the observer's vantage point. All this seems to be too abstract and of interest only to philosophers, but this is not the case. Freud's discoveries called into question the traditional conception of the mind-body dualism when he assigned to mental processes the status of causes of physical symptoms. Hysterical conversion became then the equivalent of an involuntary gesture. Hence, his clinical theories tended to be of a kind of interactive dualism. But in his more abstract theory, which he called metapsychology, he fully adhered to the physicalism and reductionism of his teachers of physiology, which implied a materialistic monism, in which mind was just an epiphenomenon of brain function. Thus he wrote on Narcissism an introduction that, quote, "All our provisional ideas in psychology will presumably someday be based on an organic substructure." As philosopher and epistemologist Abraham Kaplan wrote once, he said, "Well, I would like to see him do it." Although his definition of instinct, Trieb in German, as, quote, "a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic," end quote, suggests neutral monism, his immediate statement that it is the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body is clearly dualistic. Those contradictions have remained in the later history of psychoanalysis. As far as I know, there has been no psychoanalyst holding an idealistic view. most of them oscillate between a positivistic and a dualistic view, or simply ignore the problem. But this comes to the fore when dealing with psychosomatic disorders, which are clearly related to emotional and relational conflicts, but cannot be interpreted as symbolic gestures. Most psychoanalysts who have tackled the problem of psychosomatic illness have used some version of dualism. They start by analyzing the meaning of their patients' conflicts, but at some points of their reasoning, they have to switch over to the functional language of medicine. One special case is the work of Mahmoud Sami Ali, an Egyptian physician who trained as a psychoanalyst in France and practiced first in Cairo and then again in Paris. His novel theoretical approach, which he calls relational psychosomatics, is based on the dialectic between two different human processes, which he calls the imaginary and the real, both terms that usually refer to Lacan's work and which are roughly equivalent to Freud's primary and secondary processes. But his concept of these is quite different from these two predecessors. The imaginary includes dream thoughts, but also drawing, painting, dramatizing, dancing, singing, storytelling, relating, and play. In sum, everything that Winnicott would have included in his intermediate area. But there is a difference. Sami Ali's concept includes the body. However, this is not the body one learns about in medical studies, a biological machine of sorts, made of functional structures that operate in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry. It is rather a living experiential body, an integral part of mind, whose vicissitudes are expressed in forms that also make sense in the perspective and language of medicine. Human conflicts, whether personal, interpersonal, or collective, emerge in the core of a person's being that is this living body. They take shape through the imaginary by being dreamed, drawn, painted, enacted, narrated, poetized, sung, danced, or played. Finally, they are put into words and become the stuff of dialogue and thought in the realm of the real, and become a shared property of the group. This is the process of minding, which is also always relational, since expression is necessarily intentional in relation to other living beings. But when the imaginary is repressed, it is the function and the process that is repressed, not its contents. The conflict becomes stuck in an impasse, so that it can only be expressed by the body as a symptom, a disturbance, or a disease, and the real becomes devitalized and conventional, and existence becomes banal. Our present society has banished the imaginary, shut off dreams, creativity, and play, and generated in most people a pathology of banality, or pathology of adaptation, this being a perfect breeding ground for psychosomatic disturbances. But when therapy recoups the imaginary by means of a new relational experience, usually by narrating, drawing, modeling, singing, or enacting dreams, the real is revitalized, and eventually the conflict is negotiated by means of words and dialogue, and this solves the bodily disturbance. But the content of dreams or other imaginary expressions is not interpreted, but rather allowed to evolve and to be expressed through dialogue and relation, both in therapy with the analyst and in everyday life with one's network of relationships. And how does this relate to group analysis? Although Foulkes did not write much about the theory of psychosomatic illness, his clinical approach was quite similar to Sami Ali's. Foulkes and Anthony clearly state that a great number of patients in their groups suffer from psychosomatic symptoms. And then they add, quote, "We believe that everything that happens in the human organism can be looked upon from both aspects, the physiological as well as the psychological or mental." End quote. In group analytic therapy, this is worked through by a process he calls translation, and this is how he explains it. Quote, "Group analytic theory recognizes this translation as a part of the process of communication. In a group analytic group, all observable data are held to be relevant communications, whether they take the form of conscious or unconscious, verbal or non-verbal communications. At one end of the scale is the inarticulate symptom. It may be biting, excessive blushing, palpitation of the heart, or migraine headache. At the other end lies its representation in verbal imagery. Between these two must be cut an intricate sequence of steps leading to verbalization. Many complex processes have to play their part before the mute symptom of a fellow member can attain linguistic expression and its meaning be grasped by the others. It is the process of communication rather than the information it conveys which is important to us. In a group analytic group, communication moves from remote and primitive levels to articulate modes of conscious expression and is closely bound up with the therapeutic process." End of quote from Foulkes. We can well see now how this conception of the process is similar to Sami Ali's. The free-floating discussion in group analysis, which I prefer to call free-floating conversation, can be seen as an equivalent of play. But Foulkes' emphasis on verbal means actually leaves out much of the deployment of the imaginary. Were we to include in our groups the practice of explicit dramatizations, which would draw us nearer to psychodrama, plastic or musical expressions, or play, which would be akin to child analysis, we would benefit from the expression of the imaginary, which most certainly is an essential part of the intricate sequence of steps leading to verbalization. In any case, if we are to tackle the momentous task of constructing a new paradigm of the human being, we should indeed include in it the body and vital processes, as well as psychological and social processes. In Gregory Bateson's Ecology of Mind, all of these are deemed to be mental processes, since in them information and communication are the active causes rather than the forces and impacts of causation in natural science. This gives us an expanded concept of mind, which allows us to integrate seamlessly the body, the psyche, and the social world. Most relational approaches to analysis take exception at Freud's theory of drives. For many years, I shared this point of view. However, more recently, in a paper called The Wind and the Tide on Personal Acts and Impersonal Currents in Human Life, I suggested that even if Freud's attempt to explain the drives in terms of physical causality were discarded as inadequate, the concept still conveys a valid idea, an obscure intuition that human experience, thought, and behavior are driven by impersonal currents that act beyond our personal intentionality, whether conscious or unconscious. Such currents can be conceived as either social or biological, and here by biology I am referring to vital and bodily processes, and not to the theoretical discourse of the scientific discipline that attempts to explain them. The name of this paper, The Wind and the Tide, is derived from the metaphor of the wind, the tide, and the vessel. In this, quote, I'm quoting myself, The self is a sailing vessel with a structure, a captain, a crew, and a cargo. The weightless wind that blows the sails corresponds to the social currents, while the tide, deep, dark, and thriving with invisible life, corresponds to the ever-expanding forces of bodily existence. Life is a permanent negotiation of all these elements in order to make the trip feasible, fruitful, and happy. End of quote. Psychoanalysis has always included the body in its psychological theory, albeit it has tended to ignore the social dimension. But this vital side of human experience has been obscured by Freud's project of basing it on a mechanistic metapsychology that would eventually be reduced to a positivistic biological discourse. This view has been firmly criticized by James Home, who rejected the notion that psychoanalysis could or should be a science, and affirmed that it is one of the humanities. And Charles Rycroft, who argued that psychoanalysis is not a natural science, but a semantic science, one that looks for meanings, not causes. But he qualified this statement by saying that it is a biological theory of meaning, one that regards the self as a psychobiological entity which is always striving for self-realization and self-fulfillment. Hence, it, says Rycroft, it regards mankind as sharing with the animal and the plant world the intrinsic drive to create and recreate its own nature. End of quote. In other words, this is not a psychology that could or should ever be reduced to the discourse of positivistic biology, as Freud believed, but a psychology that included the facts and experiences derived from the recognition that we humans are living beings with a bodily existence and a vital cycle that includes relations with other living beings and belonging to an ecological environment. Such facts and experiences are birth, growth, aging, and death, as well as the need for contact and relating, and emotional, sexual, and social needs, and above all, love. Consequently, our new paradigm of the human being should be a holistic one, in the sense of studying the global properties of any given situation instead of fragmenting it and then studying the parts as required by the analytic method of natural science. In this, group analysis has a lot to give, since it was conceived by Foulkes from the very beginning as a holistic theory, in accordance with what he had learned through his relationship and work with Kurt Goldstein. Here it should be noted that James Home, whose momentous paper, The Concept of Mind, I have just quoted, was not only a psychoanalyst, but also and fundamentally a group analyst and a member of our society. It may be argued that these are only philosophical matters which are of no interest to a community of practitioners such as ours. Analysts and psychotherapists are usually more interested in theoretical, technical, or clinical themes. But the focus of this presentation is epistemological, that is, meta-theoretical. Consequently, it must remain at the most abstract level in order to expose the hidden assumption that lie behind the manifest surface of our theories and practice. This with the purpose of establishing that there is an urgent need to revise them. Besides, our discipline cannot dispense with the so-called mere philosophy. Ever since Freud, we psychoanalysts and group analysts have had to deal with and try to help people, our patients, who are struggling with the very same questions that philosophers have asked since the beginning of culture. Is life worth living? What is the meaning of life? What is good and what is bad? What should one do? Who am I? What is my place in the universe? Who are other people, and what do they mean to me? What is love? These are some of the questions that both we and our patients are trying to answer. So are the philosophers. But the difference is that, unlike them, unlike the philosophers, we deal with these questions through the study of particular cases, and instead of engaging in an armchair abstract reflection, we carry our inquiry in the concrete practice of an exploratory dialogue with other human beings, which also includes affects and an intimate, intense, and enduring relationship. Our findings are valid for the particular cases we study, and yet give us an inkling of the universal problems of human existence. Hence, the practice of analysis may be conceived as a field philosophy. You can well see that this project of developing a new paradigm of the human being is still on the making, and that I have neither put forward a version of it, nor have I claimed to have solved the problem, but rather concentrated on establishing the need for such a paradigm change and suggested some possible directions in which it may come about. The idea is not new. Indeed, many people have attempted to formulate something similar along the history of human thought, but it is presently brewing in the intellectual climate of our time as a response to a major need. For me, it emerged in November 1992 in a long conversation I had with Reina Hernandez, a colleague who was soon to become my wife. This was her idea, and it put a name to some of my major concerns that have worried me since the beginning of my study of psychoanalysis. Ever since, we have worked together in thinking, discussing, writing, and teaching on the subject. This brought about a great many articles and book chapters, 2 doctorate theses, 4 books, and a new one in preparation. The aim is much clearer now than it was 26 years ago, but there is much more work ahead, and it cannot be done by any single person or group. This is a work in process, which is being tackled by many people from different fields of human knowledge and practice, such as physical science, biology, neuroscience, psychoanalysis, group analysis, sociology, political science, philosophy, theology, hermeneutics, and the humanities, among many others. Hence, it is an interdisciplinary enterprise to which analysis may and should contribute, but only through an open dialogue with its peers in the field of human thought. There is, however, one major voice that stands out for me from this chorus, and this is that of Malcolm Pines, who has had a great influence on my thought and practice. For many decades now, Malcolm has unobtrusively toiled towards the construction of a group analytic conception of the human life that integrates psychoanalysis, group analysis, biology, the social sciences, history, politics, the arts, myth, and philosophical and ethical concerns, thus being a major contributor to this collective endeavor. Nonetheless, even though we analysts cannot claim to be the bearers of an ultimate truth, we still hold a special position in the most difficult task of integrating these widely different approaches. The fact that we strive to deal with the whole human being, including body, mind, relationship, and social participation, and thoughts, feelings, motivation, and experience, gives us an opportunity to bring together the various contributions and give them a more encompassing meaning than they would not attain if they stood by themselves. Of course, psychoanalysis and group analysis could not do it either without the knowledge and ideas provided by all the others. The very incompleteness of these ideas, which is unavoidable in process thinking, is bound to generate uneasiness in all of us. But that is as it should be. Since such distress is the ferment that nourishes the emergence of new ideas. In this momentous inquiry, there are no definitive answers, but only an unending series of successive steps in the right direction. But this is precisely what brought us to analysis in the first place. As the Spanish poet Antonio Machado once wrote, "Caminante no hay camino, se hace el camino al andar," which means, wayfarer, there is no road, it is walking that draws the path. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. I'm now going to ask Earl Hopper to provide his response. Earl is a psychoanalyst, group analyst, and organisational consultant in private practice in London. He's a fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society, an honorary member of the Institute of Group Analysis UK, an honorary member of the Group Analytic Society International, and a distinguished fellow of the American Group Psychotherapy Association. Formerly a lecturer in sociology at the London School of Economics, Cambridge University and the University of Leicester, he's an honorary tutor at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust and a member of the faculty for the postdoctoral programme at Adelphi University, New York. His special interests, as many of you will know, include the study of social issues and of personal and social trauma. The author of many books and articles in sociology, psychoanalysis and group analysis, Dr. Hopper is the editor of the New International Library of Group Analysis. He believes that he was the first person to set up twice-weekly groups in February 1969 in London, a group which is still running, though with different members. So Earl, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of equipment here. You may not be aware of it. Do I have to keep this here? I guess I do.
That's for this one.
Okay. Well, I fear that tonight is, I'm not going to win any popularity contests, but that's never bothered me in the past, and it doesn't bother me tonight. But nor have I come to pray together, and that doesn't bother me either, because I didn't think that we would have a prayer meeting of the Group Analytic Society. But I do understand that there might be a need for one. Now, my friend, you have my commiserations. Although I very much enjoyed and appreciated your lecture, you have my commiserations because you have so much to say, and I've had so little time to say it. I know what that feels like, and I feel the same tonight myself. However, responding to you is like talking to myself in an echo chamber, to a brother or even to a double, which might be quite a complicated process. After all, as you've said, you've been influenced by what I have written, and I'm very pleased to acknowledge vice versa, especially after editing The One in the Many, your last book. And I've been worried, as a matter of fact, that our audience, you guys, would experience us as a couple of old farts who are taking the opportunity to console one another. Maybe we are. But gradually, in thinking about your lecture, I've allowed myself to hope that we might be heard as a pair of dimes who are in a struggle to become a pair of docks. I must confess that lately 2 words arouse in me feelings of intense ambivalence. You've used both of them, relational and beyond. Relational. Well, on the positive side, I appreciate the emphasis is on persons as open systems rather than on organisms as relatively closed systems. However, on the negative side, this has become an excuse for sloppy clinical work. it's also an example of the well-known tendency in psychoanalysis of turning what should be a footnote into a gigantic school of thought. Beyond is the second word. Now, on the positive side, I appreciate the emphasis on process, the infinite, and on the dialectic. However, on the negative side, the implication that the new and the radical are necessarily better and deeper than the old and the conservative is really more of a political statement than an academic and a clinical one. Sometimes those objects which are new and shiny are not as useful as those which show more wear and tear. I must also confess that nowadays, at least for me, the word old often evokes the theme of the Freudian father in the context of the Old Testament, and the new, the theme of the Jungian mother and her son in the context of the New Testament. To my mind, these tropes are connected with the visceral hatred of psychoanalysis and with the rejection of the law of the father and the law of the mother, as a matter of fact, which are at the very core of psychoanalysis and classical group analysis. Of course, the Kleinian mother offers an acceptable compromise, at least in England. I hope that you'll agree, nonetheless, that we must help each other contain the tensions that are at the core of our project tonight, and to make creative use of these tensions. However, we must also remain faithful to the core axioms and values of our professions. Without such faith, we cannot really begin. There is little need for me to summarize your basic argument because you've been so clear in your presentation of it. But I would stress the following points. You appreciate the enormous contributions made by Freud and his associates, who worked from approximately 1890 to 1940, a period of almost 50 years. You would agree with Auden, the great poet, that as a theoretician, a clinician, and the founder and leader of a profession, Freud was a legend in his own lifetime. A veritable Weltanschauung, as you have said, which has allowed nonetheless for the applications to other fields and for some diversity of orientation. You recognize that in part group analysis has emerged as a response to the flaws of psychoanalytical thinking, of which there are certainly many. Theoretically, it has sought to bring back into focus the power of social facts and social forces within a transgenerational context. For example, our work on sex and gender orientations. Clinically, it has sought to emphasize the importance of traumatogenic processes, for example, the study and treatment of survivor syndromes. And professionally, it has modified the authoritarian hegemony of classical psychoanalysis in the mental health field. For example, the development of Gassi itself and Agatin. However, you've also argued that given its roots in 19th century psychoanalysis, group analysis has not gone far enough in modifying the ways that psychoanalysts and group analysts think and work, and how the wider community regards mental health and mental illness in general, hence the need for a new paradigm of what still seems to be called human nature. You might have said that group analysis has hoisted itself by its own petard through fetishizing various elements of its own not-me identity. You might even have said that group analysis has colluded with psychoanalysis in enacting a set of polarizations that were never intended and that have contributed to the current vulnerability of each of these two professions or branches of one profession. You might even have gone on to say, as I would, that if Adler, Jung, and perhaps Ferenczi had been kept within Freud's fold, psychoanalysis and group analysis would have found their natural location somewhere between biology, psychology, sociology, and theology. Still, it's important to understand that in any discipline in which the proportion of axioms to propositions, that can be tested is high, such a discipline is likely to be characterized by schisms in the search of a topic in which these schisms will be manifest. You have more or less concluded your lecture by saying that in the new paradigm, it will be essential to privilege the imaginary in the sense that all that can be dreamt, including both the symbolic and the sub-symbolic, especially the body and its sensations, not only as a source of feelings and meanings, but also as a medium of communication and a field of information. However, the imaginary takes us back to where we began, that is, with an exploration of the mysterious leap between body and mind, but in a new context of an age of technology and the reduction of information to a matter of energy. Now, this might, of course, present us with more problems than it actually solves. For example, it might lead to the avoidance of taking political and moral responsibility for our own insights. However, you have also favored taking more risks in expressing our concerns and even our confusions. You have ended your lecture with an appreciation of your beloved wife, Raina, who has been your partner in creativity, with an acknowledgement of your indebtedness to Malcolm Pines and his work. Well, we all need a Raina, and we all need a Malcolm. However, I would suggest that in ending your lecture in this way, you have symbolically illustrated how in the human condition our ending is in our beginning, and our beginning is in our ending. In other words, there is no exit from the constraints and restraints of Western styles of thought and feeling. And in denying this, we tend to create wastelands rather than fertile deltas. Perhaps for my purposes tonight, I should express my own indebtedness to my two formative disciplines, sociology and psychoanalysis. Now, I particularly like the following elements of your argument. The allusions to the work of such diverse theorists as Bregler, Lacan, Winnicott, and Pichon-Rivière in one lecture. The emphasis on a process theory of the mind, which transcends both the body and the socio-cultural context of it. The emphasis on the idea that the selection of a fact from the magma is always a relational act, I've used the word, within a philosophical and political field. The appreciation of a sociology of knowledge, and this is important, based on understanding that what we know is regulated by both fantasies and interests. I would have welcomed, however, more scholarship of local sources. For example, the work of Martin Wigman, who has our permission to narrate the name of his book, to Dick Blackwell, our expert consultant on the Middle East, and even to that of Chaim Weinberg, our virtual senator from California. Christopher Rance certainly should be mentioned. He's our local chaplain of the society. A more appreciation of the core elements of what you would call the old paradigm might also be important. The dynamics of life trajectories and psychological regression and progression within a social context. The healing power of the analysis of transference and countertransference processes can't be rejected. The Oedipus complex, which you've mentioned, but in all its glory, which involves multiple perspectives based on fantasies, relationships, and even traumatogenic processes. I think the total situation is also important, maybe originating with the work of Goldstein, but coming into fruition in this country, the curiously Kleinian work of Betty Joseph. The development and maintenance of personal and social identities. This is so important. And finally, the existentialist perspective in group analysis, which is often overlooked. I would also have welcomed an acknowledgement of how unrealistic our hopes and expectations have been with respect to the zealous treatment of virtually all psychological ailments, and to the omnipotent reaching out to all sections of the community, no matter what their circumstances and characteristics. Surely this has contributed to a chronic sense of disappointment rather than to a sense of optimism. It's also contributed to a sense of collective envy of what we've achieved and continue to achieve, rather than collective gratitude. Now, going forward, the late Imre Lakatos, who some of you might know, I guess I'm maybe the only one here who remembers him, who was a philosopher of science at Cambridge University and then at London School of Economics. He was in a way a student or an assistant of Karl Popper, offered trenchant criticisms of the notion of an abstract paradigm without a program for discussion and research. In the late 1960s, we used to drink coffee together on Saturday mornings in Hampstead. We would sit together mourning the loss of a Marxist perspective in what had become the fashionable discussion of paradigms. Although Imre hated psychoanalysis, he would have agreed with me some of the following points. Our current project is not so much a matter of going beyond as it is of fully embracing what is already there, much of which has not been recognized, let alone fully realized, and much more often honored in its breach than in its observance. He would also have agreed that the imaginary, well, as you yourself acknowledge, is closely related to the indeterminate, the transitional, and the intermediate, and to the sociocultural in general, each and all of which require an appreciation of the paradox that we are largely co-created by that which we have co-created, and we are mostly unconscious of the process. Our challenge in this paradox is to maintain the conflicts and inconsistencies that are inherent in it, to recognize the conflicts and inconsistencies, to manage them, and to use them for purposes of growth, not to run from them. Incidentally, this point, it seems to me, was recognized in the title of the recent international workshop of the Israeli Institute of Group Analysis, Roots and Wings. Now, I personally define hope as the ability and willingness to exercise the transcendent imagination. Enhancing hope within therapy is a bit like sculpting a representation of an image from a piece of marble, a bit like releasing Ariel from Prospero's entrapment, and even a bit like being a good gardener who helps a plant to realize its potential. But hope is not only a virtue, it's also a social psychological achievement. Like the unconscious itself, hope is also more of a verb than a noun. It involves action, not just naming it. Now, the late Louis Zinken, who some of you undoubtedly do remember, a Jungian group analyst, very much appreciated the theological implications of the recognition of the emergence of a new social fact, as seen, for example, in a change through which a collection of people becomes a group of people. Think about this. A collection becomes a group. For him, this caesura confirmed the possibility of the new and of creativity itself, which he believed was inherent in the group analytical orientation, and I agree with him. As a source of creativity, charisma always breaks the frame. However, I too often forget to locate the cosmic realm in my various diagrams of the tripartite matrix. It's probably, I'm still loyal to sociology. I'm not sure whether it's my mother or father. But I wonder if the cosmic is omnipresent or if it constitutes a fourth submatrix. Perhaps the cosmic is an organismic component of the personal matrix, as you have implied, actually, in the conclusion of your lecture. Now, what is our challenge? It seems to me that we will always have to find, both theoretically and clinically, an optimal balance between an emphasis on, first of all, processes of introjection and processes of projection in the human condition. Second, we will always have to find some way of regulating levels of normative expectations and levels of achievement with regard to objects that are valued as goals. And thirdly, we will always have to respect that therapy in the service of recognizing limits and limitations must be balanced with therapy in the service of psychic feeding, replacement for nourishment that was traumatically lost and for nourishment that was never available in the first place. In that respect, in those three respects, we will always have to struggle with the implications of Freud's dictum that neurosis differs from ordinary human misery, no matter how closely and even clearly related they may be. Now, I would say, in the course of preparing my response to your lecture, I've become much more of a psychoanalyst and classical group analyst than I have ever been. And this has helped me feel more confident in my professional and clinical identities. And I thank you very much for this challenge. I also thank you very much for your Foulkes Lecture. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Earl. We'll now have 10 minutes for questions from the floor. There'll be 2 microphones available. Our helpers, I'll bring them round for you. I suspect there's rather a lot to take in.
Both presentations make me think, where is the preschool child in a caring, parliament-sized group? Because I think that, for me, is a paradigm which I try to approach. We can hear in a large group, a parliament-sized group even, and outside another parliament-sized group. As an architect, I know that we can hear and see each other at 25-meter distance, and even 1,000 people can gather in such a group. When I look at the law of Moses, not as a father, but as a son-in-law, he hears from his Arab father-in-law that he needs help, and the people that have chosen him as their leader need help. And he says, you can solve it only, you cannot answer all the questions of the people regarding the law. They must do it among themselves, in groups of 10, of 50, of 100, and of 1,000. They must choose their own candidate leaders of the group discourse. And then Moses has the choice from 2 or more candidates to appoint one who is most appointed by the group, and by Moses. And this story of both endogamy among the Israelites and exogamy, because some of the Israelites marry non-Israelites, like Moses did. And that's the health of large groups. And if the large group takes care...
I wonder if we could wind it up so that we
Then
can
I
have
want to, yes, I round it off. If the large group of 1,000 takes care of the preschool children by welcoming them and involving the school-age children in this welcome, then you need only some tens of hours in the year to develop that caring parliament-sized groups, where children of preschool age already become aware of it.
Thank you. Shall we take a few questions
Yes.
together and then this one here?
Hello, Juan. I enjoyed very much your speech. For me, it was a very wide, profound, and refreshing reflection about what we are as practitioners, as thinkers, and you has raised several, for me, questioning. Especially one, I would like to ask you what you think about this idea that I share with you, is this that we don't have enough conceptualization of what really happens in the groups. We are still stuck with what you say, psychoanalytic, bidirectional references, and we have a lacking of real descriptions and understanding what is the communication and the sharing of the group events. And that's one of your challenges that I disagree with you with the question of the relation between body and mind. I would suggest you that we call neutral dualism, I would call dual monism. And, but I enjoy very much, and I would say, what are more your suggestions for us to think about? Thank you very much.
I think we have plenty of time for comments as well as questions.
Well, thank you for two very interesting presentations. One aspect which came to my mind, which I had some experience, is in a group situation, sometimes it can be very successful, which is somewhat an old technique but not taught about much these days, that is brainstorming. I have come across when in a particular, I think I can mention in a certain food company, Unilever, when I went there as a consultant with another person, they wanted to come up with a concept for integrated technology about which they didn't have any concrete idea, and they wanted to throw around between the different divisions. But by getting some of the managers together and starting an interactive process of throwing out ideas spontaneously, even without any logic or questions, we were able to ultimately distill out a concept which worked for the whole of the division. So I wonder whether how this applies to psychoanalytic groups that you are dealing with.
One of the recent developments in the world of psychoanalysis is the whole field of neuropsychoanalysis and its application in particular to trauma and the impacts of trauma on brain architecture. My question is this a helpful thing for the project that you're outlining? Is it about an integration of physical and mental, or is it an unhelpful thing that ties psychoanalysis and by extension group analysis ultimately to some materialistic version of selfhood?
Try something. I don't think I can respond directly to the questions, but to say what they make me think about. Neuropsychoanalysis is a sensitive subject for me. It is a sensitive subject because when I was studying medicine, I worked in a physiology department as a research and teaching assistant. I was still a student of medicine, and at the time I was, when I started to study psychoanalysis, I was very much interested in trying to integrate metapsychology with neurophysiology. Over the years, I abandoned that project. Nowadays, I have a not so popular opinion that metapsychology has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. That it was Freud subservience to the kind of medicine and medical studies he had learned, but I feel that, like some other people, that psychoanalysis should have its own theory based on its own experience and not try to be reduced to the experience of a completely different discipline. So the question, is it useful? I'm quite happy that neuroscientists are beginning, for some time now, to be interested in human life. And that they are interested in things such as relationships, social participation, mutual understanding, communication, emotions. And I think that some of them have gone quite far in their research. For example, I've been reading lately this book of The Error of Descartes by Antonio Damasio. Yes, and I like it very much, but what I like of the book is not it's neurophysiology, but it's philosophy. I mean, he's a philosophical thinker, a philosopher of biology, and what he says is pretty much akin to what I believe we have learned from analysis. But I do not think that that our knowledge can be in any way reduced to or based on the knowledge derived from neuroscience. And sometimes I'm rather angry when I hear some colleagues saying, oh, nowadays with the discovery of mirror neurons, now finally empathy has become a scientific concept. We don't need neurophysiologists to tell us what we have known for 100 years now. No, we have always known it, and it's not something that has to be proved by them.
I'm not sure that we've always known it, but I would also say that the notion of the concept of the mirror neuron is the most overvalued concept in human neurology that I've come across. Overvalued and over-exaggerated, but it is intuitively obvious to grasp, which has led to its popularity.
Yeah.
But I do think that this question is simply asked, simply put, is very important. And although I agree with much of what Juan has just said, I would have to say that for us not to take on in a respectful way this project would be a great mistake. After all, the body is very much intertwined with the person, as Juan and I have each said, and we think the person is completely intertwined between the body and the group, etc., etc. So it must carry a lot of information. I would be also add to that, though. I'm a member of a study group of neurology and psychoanalysis, and I learned from this. However, I think it has to be said that many people who are involved in the project, although I don't want to interpret it away, seem to have to be motivated to somehow find another way of saying the same things that psychoanalysts are saying. There's a kind of unconscious, well, I think it's unconscious largely, but it's a motivation to denigrate. The motivation is an attempt to denigrate what we know about unconscious processes, which we can't yet explain neurologically. So when I feel that, when I'm in the seminar, it stops me from thinking almost, and I feel I'm in a political seminar once again, rather than in a scientific one. Not that I'm completely pure in that respect. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not.
Thank you. Me too will have to stop. I think it's an interesting question of whether we need to go beyond the paradigm, whether we need to rediscover some of the things that are available to us already. And I think we still struggle with the really holding on to the idea that the unconscious, the social, and the body are part of a unitary process. But we've had food for our minds. It is now time to feed the body. So there will be drinks and refreshments outside. Thank you. We'll see many of you tomorrow at the Institute of Education. Thank you.